A startled murmur ran through the audience as one of the eggs rocked more violently. The sudden snapping of the shell seemed to resound through the high-ceilinged cavern, and the dragons on the upper ledges hummed more loudly than ever with encouragement. The actual hatching had begun. Pemer didn't know where to look because the audience was as fascinating as the hatching. Dragon riders' faces with soft glows as they relived the magic moment when they had impressed the hatchling dragon who became their life's companion. I can't get this straight. There we go. Minds indissolubly linked. On other faces was hope, breathless and incredulous, as guests and parents of the candidates waited for the moment when their lads would be chosen or rejected by the hatchlings. Fire lizards, respectfully quiet, perched on many shoulders in the ground. And Pemer, who could never aspire to impress a dragon, was reminded of that unfilled promise that he would have a fire lizard one day. He wondered if Manoli remembered her promise to him, or if he'd ever have the opportunity to remind her of it. "There's Felicin," said Manoli, nudging him sharply with her elbow. She pointed to a leggy figure with such a luxuriant growth of dark curling hair that his head seemed oversized. "He doesn't even look nervous," said Pemer, as he noted the signs of apprehension in other candidates who shifted uneasily or twitched unnecessarily at their tunics. A concerted gasp directed their attention from Felicin, and they saw that several more eggs were rocking violently as the hatchling struggled to be free. Abruptly, an egg split open, and a moist little brown dragon was spilled to his feet on the hot sands.
Moist!
Dragging his fragile-looking damp wings on the ground, he began to lunge this way and that, calling piteously while the adult dragons crooned encouragement, reinforced by Ramoth's half-hum, half-howl. The boys nearest the dragonette tried to anticipate his direction, hoping to impress him, but he lurched out of their immediate circle, staggering across the sands, his call plaintive, desperate, until the next group of boys turned. One, prompted by some instinct, took a step forward. The little brown's cries turned joyous. He tried to extend his wet wings to bridge the distance between them, but the boy rushed to the dragon's side, caressing head and shoulders, patting the damp wings while the little hatchling crooned with triumph, his jeweled eyes glowing the blue and purple of love and devotion. The day's first impression had been made. Pemer heard Manoli's deep and satisfied sigh and knew that she was reliving the moment she'd impressed her fire lizards in the Dragonstone's cave 3 turns ago. He was again assailed by a deep stab of envy. When would he rate a fire lizard? Excited cries brought his attention back to the hatching ground as more eggs cracked, exposing their occupants. "Watch Felicin, Pemer! There's a bronze near him!" cried Miriam, grabbing Pemer's arm in her excitement. "And 2 browns and a blue," added Manoli, scarcely less excited, as she canted her body in a mental effort to direct the little bronze toward Felicin. "He deserves a bronze! He deserves one!" "Only if the dragon wants him," said Miriam sententiously. "Just because he's the Weirleader's son." "Shut up, Miriam," said Pemer, exasperated, clutching his fists, urging the impression to occur. Felicin was aware of the bronze's proximity, but so were a handful of other candidates. The little creature, rocking unstably on his wobbly legs, seemed not to see any of them for a moment. Then the wedge-shaped head fell forward and got buried in the sand as his hind legs overbalanced him. It was too much. Felicin gently righted the little beast and then stood transfixed, the expression on his exultant face plainly visible to his friends as impression was made. Ramoth's bugle astonished everyone into a long moment of silence, but it was no wonder, Pemer thought, that Flor and Lessa were embracing each other at the sight of their one child impressing a bronze. The excitement was over too soon, Pemer thought, just moments later. He wished that all the eggs hadn't hatched at once, so this dizzy happiness could be extended. Not that there wasn't some disappointment and sadness, too, because far more candidates were presented to the eggs than could impress. Only one little green had not impressed, and she was mewling unhappily, butting one boy out of her way, lurching to another and peering up into his face, obviously searching for just the right lad. She had worked her way toward the tears, despite the efforts of the remaining candidates to attract her attention and keep her well out into the ground. "Whatever is the matter with those boys?" demanded Miriam, frowning with anxiety over the little green's pathetic wandering. She stood up, gesturing peremptorily to the candidates to close around the little green. Just then the creature began to croon urgently and made directly for the steps that led up to the tiers. "What is possessing her?" Miriam asked no one in particular. She looked behind her accusingly, as if somehow a candidate might be hiding among the guests. "She wants someone not on the ground," rang a voice from the crowd. "She's going to hurt herself," said Miriam in an agitated mutter, and pushed past the 3 people seated between her and the stairs. "She'll bruise her wings on the walls." The little green did hurt herself, slipping off the first step and banging her muzzle so sharply on the stone that she let out a cry of pain, echoed by a fierce bugle from Ramoth, who began to move across the sands. "Now listen here, you silly thing. The boys you want are out there on the ground. Turn yourself around and go back to them," Miriam was saying as she made her way down the steps to the little green. Her fire lizards, calling out in wildly ecstatic buglings, halted her. She stared for a long moment at the antics of her friends, and then, her expression incredulous, she looked down at the green hatchling determinedly attacking the obstacle of steps. "I can't!" Miriam cried, so panic-stricken that she slipped on the steps herself and slid down 3 before her flailing hands found support. "I can't!" Miriam glanced about her for confirmation. "I'm not supposed to impress. I'm not a candidate. She can't want me." Awe washed over the consternation on her face and in her voice. "If it's you she wants, Miriam, get down there before she hurts herself," said Flour, who had by now reached the scene, Lessa beside him. "But I'm not." "It would seem that you are," Miriam said Lessa, her face reflecting amusement and resignation. "The dragon's never wrong. Come, be quick about it, girls. She's scraping her chin raw to get to you." With one final startled look at her weirleaders, Miriam half slid the remaining steps, cushioning the little green's chin from yet another harsh contact with the stone of the step. "Oh, you silly darling. Whatever made you choose me?" Miriam said in a loving voice as she gathered the green into her arms and began to soothe. "Oh, good job, buddy!"
What did he do?
His tooth came out.
Oh!
"Hold on to it until I'm done reading, okay?" And began to soothe the hatchling's distressed cries. "She says her name is Path." The glory on Miriam's face caused Pemer to look away in embarrassment and envy. For one brief moment, Pemer had entertained the bizarre notion that maybe the little green dragon had been looking for him. A deep sigh fluttered through his lips, and a hand was laid gently on his shoulder. Schooling his expression, he turned to see Manoli watching him, a deep pity and understanding in her eyes. "I promised you turns ago that you'd have a fire lizard, Pemer. I haven't forgotten. I will keep that promise." As one, they turned their heads back to watch Miriam fussing over her path, her fire lizards hopping about on the sands, chattering away as if welcoming the little green in their own fashion. "Come on, you two," said Sibel, as Miriam began encouraging Path to walk out of the hatching ground. "We'd better see Master Robinson. This is going to cause problems." The last he said in a low voice. "Why?" asked Pemer, making sure they weren't overheard. But everyone was filing out of the tiers now, eager to congratulate or condole. "She's wheel-bred." "Greens are fighting dragons," began Sibel. "In that case, Miriam's well-paired, isn't she?" asked Pemer with droll amusement. "Pemer!" At Manoli's shocked remonstrance, Pemer turned to Sibel and saw an answering gleam, though the journeyman quickly turned and started down the steps. "Sibel's right, though," Manoli said thoughtfully as they started across the hot sands, quickening their pace as the heat penetrated the soles of their flying boots. "Why?" asked Pemer again. "Just because she's a girl?" "There won't be as much shock as there might be," Sibel went on. "Jackson's impression of Bruce set a precedent." "It's not quite the same thing, Sibel," Manoli replied. "Jackson is a lord holder and has to remain so. And then the Weirman did think the little white dragon mightn't live. And now he has. It's obvious he's never going to be full-sized. Not that he's needed in the Weirs, but Miriam is." "Exactly, and not in the capacity of a green rider." "I think she'd make a good fighting rider," said Pemer, keeping the comment carefully under his breath. When they located Master Robinson, he was already earnestly discussing the matter with O'Haran. "Completely unexpected. Miriam swears that she hadn't been in the hatching ground at all when the candidates were familiarizing themselves with the eggs," Master Robinson told his craftsman. Then he smiled. fortunately with Fellison impressing a bronze, Lessa and Flower in great spirits. Now he shrugged, his grin broadening. It was simply a case of the dragon finding her own partnership where she wanted it. As Ruth did with Jackson. Precisely. And that is the Harper message? Asked Sibel, glancing about the ball where knots of people surrounded weirlings and dragonettes. There doesn't seem to be any other explanation. So let us drink and be merry. It's a good day for Pern, and I'm terribly dry, said the Master Harper, as the Weir Harper solemnly proffered a cup of wine. Oh, thanks, O'Haran. Must be the heat of the hatching ground or the excitement. I'm parched. The Harper's sigh was of relief and pleasure. A good Bendon vintage. An old one. The wine has a mellowness, a smoothness. He glanced about him as his audience waited expectantly. O'Haran's hand casually covered the seal of the wineskin. The Harper took another judicious sip. Yes, indeed. I have it now. The pressing of 10 turns back, and furthermore, he held up a finger, it's from the northwestern slopes of Upper Bendon. O'Haran slowly uncovered the seal, and the others saw that the Master Harper had been absolutely correct. I don't know how you do it, Master Robinson, said O'Haran, having hoped to confound his master. He's had a lot of practice, said Manoli at her driest, and they all laughed as Master Robinson started to protest. They had time for a quiet glass before the admiring guests had exhausted all the possible things one could say, nice, to a newly impressed pair. Then the Weirling Master took his charges off to the lake where the newly hatched would be fed, bathed, and oiled, and the guests began to drift toward the tables, seating themselves for the feasting that would follow. Master Robinson led his craftsmen in a rousing ballad of praise to dragons and their riders before he joined the Weir leaders and their visiting lord holders. O'Haran, Sibel, Manoli, and Pemer did the courtesy round to the tables, where the parents of new dragon riders were seated, singing requests. Manoli's fire lizard sang several songs with her before she excused them, explaining that they were far more interested in the new dragons than singing for mere people. Then she got involved with a group from the craft hall at Vitra, and the other 3 Harpers left her explaining how to teach fire lizards to sing as they continued the rounds. The tradition was that a Harper's song deserved a cup of wine. Chatting as they drank, Sibel and O'Haran took turns directing conversation where they wished it, Miriam's unexpected impression. There was, to be sure, considerable surprise that Miriam had done so, but most of those queried found it to be no large affair. After all, they said Miriam was Weir-bred, a fosterling of Brecky's, had impressed 3 of the first fire lizards to be found at Southern, so her unexpected rise to Dragon Rider was at least consistent. Now Jackson, who had to remain Lord of Ruatha, was a different case entirely. Pemer noticed that everyone was a good deal interested in the health of the little white dragon, and while they wished him the best, were just as pleased that he'd never make a full-size beast. Evidently it made it easier for people to accept the fact that Ruth was being raised in a hold instead of a weir. Holdlessness was a topic to which conversations returned time and again that evening. Many lads growing up in landcrafts would not find holdings of their own when they were old enough. There simply weren't any old places left. Could not more of the mountainous regions of the far north be made habitable? Or the remote slopes of High Reaches or Crom? Pemer noted that Nabol, which actually had tenable land uncultivated, was never sighted. What about the marshlands of Lower Bendon? Surely with such a competent weir, more holds could be protected. Occasionally Pemer, standing or sitting at the edges of the group, would overhear fascinating snatches and try to make sense of them. Mostly he discarded them as gossip, but one stuck in his tired mind. Lord Otterl had been the speaker. He didn't know the other man, though his lighter clothes suggested he came from the southern part of Pern. Maron gets more than his share, and we go without. Girls impress fighting dragons, and our lads stand on the ground. Ridiculous! Pemer found it getting progressively harder to rise from one table and move to another. Not that he was drinking any wine. He had sense enough not to do that. He just seemed to be more tired than he ought to be, if he could just put his head down for a few moments. He was scarcely conscious of the cold of between, only annoyed because he was being forced to walk when he wanted to sit down. He did recall some sort of argument going on over his head. He could have sworn it was Selvina giving someone the very rough edge of her tongue. He was mercifully grateful that finally he was permitted to stretch out on a bed, feel furs pulled over his shoulders, and he could give in to the sleep he craved. The bell woke him, and his surroundings confused him. He looked about, trying to figure out where he was, since he certainly wasn't in the drum apprentice's quarters. Further, he was on a rush bag on a floor. The floor in Sibel's room, for the clothes Sibel had been wearing for the past 2 days, were draped on a nearby chair, his flying boots sagging against each other by the bed. Peemer's empty clothes had been neatly piled on his boots at the foot of the rush bag. The bell continued to ring, and Peemer, keenly aware of the emptiness of his belly, hastily dressed, paused long enough to splash his face and hands with water in case anyone, like Dearzen, wanted to fault him on cleanliness, and proceeded down the corridor to the steps in the dining hall. He was just turning into the hall when Clell and the other 3 came in the main door. Clell flashed a look at the others and then strode up to Peemer, grabbing him by the arm roughly. "Where have you been for the past 2 days? Why, did you have to polish the drums?" "You're gonna get it from Dearzen." A pleased smirk crossed Clell's face. "Why should he get it from Dearzen, Clell?" asked Manoli, quietly coming up behind the drum apprentices. "He's been on Harper business." "He's always getting off on Harper business," replied Clell with unexpected anger, "and always with you." Peemer raised his fist at such insolence and leaned back to make the swing count in Clell's sneering face, but Manoli was quicker. She swung the apprentice about and shoved him forcefully toward the main door. "Insolence to a journeyman means water rations for you, Clell," she said, and without bothering to see that he'd continue out of the hall, she turned to the other 3 who gawked at her. "And for you, too, if I should learn of any mischief against Peemer because of this. Have I made myself perfectly clear, or do I need to mention the incident to Master Alodki?" The cowed apprentices murmured the necessary assurances, and, at her dismissal, lost themselves in the throng of other apprentices. "How much trouble have you been having in the Drum Heights, Peemer?" "Nothing I can't handle," said Peemer, wondering when he could get back at Clell for that insult to Manoli. "Water rations for you, too, Peemer, if I see so much as a scratch on Clell's face." "But he—" Bonds, Timony, and Brawley came flying into the hall at that point and hailed Peemer with such evident relief that, after giving Peemer a long, forbidding glance, Manoli went off toward the journeyman's tables. The boys demanded to know where he'd been, and he was to tell them everything. He didn't. He told them what he felt they should know as far as the Eganhold gather was concerned, an innocuous enough tale, and he could, and did, describe in great detail the impression of Path to Miram. The bare bones of that unexpected event was already the talk of the hall, and Peemer had heard the public version so often that he knew he wasn't committing any indiscretion. He was careful to play down, even to his good friends, the circumstances that had brought him to Bend and Weir at such an auspicious occasion. No dragon rider was going to take me, an apprentice Harper, all the way back to the hall when there was a hatching, so I had to stay. "Come on, Peemer," said Bonds, thoroughly disgusted with his indifference. "You can't ever get me to believe that you didn't enjoy every moment of it." "Then I won't, 'cause I did. But I was just bloody lucky to be at the Egan gather right then. Otherwise, I'd have been polishing the big drums yesterday." "Say, Peemer, you getting on all right with Clell and those others?" asked Ranley. "Sure. Why?" Peemer kept his voice as casual as he could. "Oh, nothing. Except they're not mixers, and lately they've been sort of asking about you in a funny sort of way."
Yeah. You left.
Pick your cup up, please. Ranley was worried, and from the solemn expressions on
There's
their...
apple cider on the couch.
It's tea. It's okay. We'll deal with it in a minute. It's tea, right, Elliot?
Yes.
Okay.
There's no more apple cider.
We'll deal with it later.
There isn't any apple cider.
Dibba! Ranley was worried, and from the solemn expressions on their other faces, he had confided their concern. "You just haven't been the same since your voice changed, Peemer," said Timony, blushing with embarrassment. Peemer snorted, then grinned because Timony looked so uncomfortable. "Of course I'm not, Tim. How could I be? My voice is changing, and the rest of me, too." "I didn't mean that," and Timony faltered in a muddle of confusion, looking at Bonds and Brawley to help to express what puzzled them all. Just then the journeyman rose to give out the day's assignments, and the apprentices were forced to be quiet. Peemer held his breath, hoping that Manoli had not made Clell's discipline a public one, and felt relieved when it was obvious that she hadn't. He was going to have enough trouble with Clell as it was. Not that he worried about the apprentice going hungry. He'd seen the other 3 secreting bread, fruit, and a thick wary slice to smuggle out to him. As the sections dispersed for their work parties, Peemer went to the drum heights, wondering exactly what awaited him. He was not surprised to find that the drums had been left for him to polish, or that Dearzen grumbled about his absence, because how could he learn enough to be a proper drummer? And it was only to be expected that there was no word of praise from Dearzen when he came out measure perfect on all the sequences Dearzen asked him. What Peemer wasn't prepared for was the state of his belongings when Dearzen dismissed him, He got the first whiff when he opened the door to the apprentice's room. Despite the fact that both windows were propped wide open, the small room smelled like the necessary. He opened the press for clean clothes and realized where the worst of the offending stench lay. He turned, half hoping this was all, but as he ran his hand over his sleeping furs, they were disgustingly damp. "Who's been—" Durzin came striding into the room, finger and thumb pinching his nose against the odor. Pemer said nothing. He merely let the soiled clothing unroll and held the furs up so that the light fell on the long, damp stain. Durzin's eyes narrowed and his grimace deepened. Pemer wondered what annoyed Durzin more, that Pemer's unexpectedly long absence had made the joke more noisome than necessary, or that here was proof positive that Pemer was being harassed by his roommates. "You may be excused from other duties to attend to this," said Durzin. "Be sure to bring back a sweet candle to clear the odor." How they could sleep with that! Durzin waited until Pemer had cleared the noxious things from the room, and then he slammed the door with such force that the journeyman on watch came to see what was the matter. With everyone scattered for work sections, do you guys get what happened?
No.
The other apprentices peed on his bed and his clothes.
Ew!
With everyone scattered for work sections, Pemer managed to get to the washing room without being stopped. Because they were being mean. He was so furious he wouldn't have trusted himself to answer properly if anyone had asked him the most civil of questions. He slapped the furs hair side out into the warm tub, sprinkling half of the jar of sweet sand on the slowly sinking bedding. He shook the half-hardened stuff out of his clothing into the drain and then with the washing paddle shoved and prodded the garments to loosen the incrustations. If there were stains on his new clothes, he'd face a month's water rations, but he'd pay them all back, so he would. "What are you doing in here at this time of day, Pemer?" asked Sylvina, attracted by the splashing and pounding. "Me?" The force of his tone brought Sylvina right into the room. "My roommates play dirty jokes." Sylvina gave him a long, searching look as her nose told her what kind of dirty jokes. "Any reason for them to?" In a split second, Pemer decided. Sylvina was one of the few people in the hall he could trust. She instinctively knew when he was shamming, so she'd know now that he was being put on. And he had an unbearable need and urge to release some of the troubles he had suppressed. This last trick of the apprentice's, damaging his good new clothes, hurt more than he had realized in the numbness following the discovery. He'd been so proud of the fine garments, and to have them crudely soiled before he'd worn some of them enough to acquire honest dirt hit him harder than the slanders at his supposed indiscretions. "I get to gathers and impressions." Pemer drew a whistling breath through his teeth, "and I made the mistake of learning drum measures too fast and too well." Sylvina continued to stare at him. Her eyes slightly narrowed and her head tilted to one side. Abruptly, she moved beside him and took the wash paddle from his hand, slipping it deftly under the soaking furs. "They probably expected you back right after the Egan gather," she chuckled as she plunged the fur back under the water, grinning broadly at him, "so they had to sleep in the stink they caused for 2 nights. Her laughter was infectious, and Pemer found his spirits lifting as he grinned back at her. "That Clell, he's the one who planned it. Watch him, Pemer, he's got a mean streak." Then she sighed. "Still, you won't be there long, and it won't do you any harm to learn the drum measures. Could be very useful one day." She gave him another long, appraising look. "I'll say this for you, Pemer. You know when to keep your tongue in your head. Here, put that through the wringer now, and let's see if we've got the worst out." Sylvina helped him finish the washing, and asked him all about the hatching and Miriam's unexpected impression of a green dragon, and how did he find the climate in Egan. It was as much a relief for him to talk to Sylvina without restraint as to have her expert help in cleaning his clothes. Then, because she said nothing would be dry before evening, she got him another sleeping fur and a spare shirt and pants, commenting they were well worn, not enough not to cause envy. "You'll mention, of course, that I tore strips out of you for ruining good cloth and staining fur," she said, with a parting wink. He was halfway out of the hall when he remembered the need for a sweet candle and went back for it, bearing her loud grumbles to the rest of the kitchen with fortitude. Afterwards, Pemer thought that if Durzin had ignored the mischief the way Pemer intended to, the whole incident might have been forgotten. But Durzin reprimanded the others in front of the journeyman and put them on water rations for 3 days. The sweet candle cleared the quarters of the stench, but nothing would ever sweeten the apprentices toward Pemer after that. It was almost as if Pemer... Charlotte, please stop. It was almost as if Pemer thought Durzin was determined to ruin any chance Pemer had of making friends with Clell or the others. Though he did his best to stay out of their vicinities, he was constantly having benches shoved into his shins in the study room, His feet trod on everywhere, his ribs painfully struck by drumsticks or elbows. His furs were sewn together 3 nights running, and his clothes were so frequently dipped in the roof gutters that he finally asked Brawley to make him a locking mechanism for his press that he alone could open. Apprentices were not supposed to have any private containers, but Derzin made no mention of the addition to Pemer's box. In a way, Pemer found a certain satisfaction in being able to ignore the nuisances, rising above all the pettiness perpetrated on him with massive and complete disdain. He spent as much time as he could studying the drum records, tapping his fingers on his fur even when he was falling asleep to memorize the times and rhythms of the most complicated measures. He knew the others knew exactly what he was doing, and there was nothing they could do to thwart him. Unfortunately, the coolness he developed to fend off their little tricks began insidiously to come between him and his old friends. Bonds and Brawley complained loudly that he was different, while Timony watched him with mournful eyes, as if he somehow considered himself responsible for Pemer's alterations. Pemer tried to laugh it off, saying he was drum-happy. "They're putting on you up in the drum heights, Pemer," said Bonds, glowering loyally. "I just know they are. And if Clell isn't," Pemer said in a tone so fierce that Bonds racked back on his heels. "That's exactly what I mean, Pemer," said Brawley, who wasn't easily intimidated by a boy he'd known for 5 turns and still topped by a full head. "You're different, and don't give me that old wheeze about your voice changing and you with it. Your voice is settling. You haven't cracked in days." Pemer blinked, mildly surprised at the phenomenon of which he'd been unaware. "It's too bad. Anyhow, Tilden's got the part down, finally, and it wouldn't sound the same with you as baritone," Brawley went on. "Baritone?" Pemer's voice broke in surprise, and when he saw the disappointment on his friends' faces, he started to laugh. "Well, maybe, and then maybe not." "Now you sound like Pemer," said Bonds, shouting with emphasis. Isolated as he'd been in the drum heights, Pemer had easily managed to forget the fast-approaching feast at Lord Grohy's and the performance of Domic's new music. 2 7 days had passed since the Bendon hatching, and he'd been too engrossed with his own problems to give much attention to extraneous matters. His friends now underlined the nearness of the feast, and he was sure he couldn't escape attending it, and wondered how he could. He'd prefer to be out of Fort Hold altogether on the night of the performance, because sure as eggs cracked, he'd have to go to it. Then it occurred to him that he hadn't been on any trips with Sibel and Manoli lately. He forced himself to laugh and joke with his friends in a fair imitation of his old self. But once back at the drum heights, while he stood his afternoon watch, he began to wonder if he'd done something wrong at Bendon Weir or Egan Hold, or if, by any freak chance, Derzin's tittle-tattle had affected Manoli's opinion of him. Come to think of it, he hadn't seen Sibel at all of late. The next morning, when he was feeding the fire lizards with her, he asked her where the journeyman was. "Between you and me," she said in a low voice, having seen Camo occupied with the greedy anti-one, "he's up in the ranges. He should be back tonight." "Don't worry, Pemer," she said, smiling. "We haven't forgotten you." Then she gave him a very searching look. "You haven't been worried, have you?" "Me? No, why should I worry?" He gave a derisive snort. "I put my time to good use. I know more drum measures than any of those dim-wits, for all they've been mucking about up there for turns." Manoli laughed. "Now you sound more like yourself. You're all right with Master Olodki, then?" "Me? Sure." Which Pemer felt was not stretching the truth. He was fine with Master Olodki because he rarely came into contact with the man. "And that rough lad, Clell, he's not come back at you for the other day, has he?" "Manoli," said Pemer, taking a stern tone with her. "I'm Pemer. No one gets back at me. What gave you such a notion?" He sounded as scornful as he could. "Just that you haven't been as... well," and she smiled half apologetically. "Oh, never mind. I expect you can take care of yourself any time, anywhere." They continued feeding the fire lizards, and Pemer wished heartily that he could tell Manoli the real state of affairs in the drum heights. But what good would it do? She could only speak to Derzin, who would never accept Pemer for any reason. Asking Derzin to discipline the other apprentice for what was only stupid petty narking wouldn't help. Pemer could see clearly now that his well-founded reputation for mischief and game-playing were coming back at him when he least expected, or even less deserved it. He'd no one but himself to fault, so he'd just have to chew it raw and swallow. After all, once his voice settled, he'd be out of the drum heights. He could put up with it because he'd have the odd gather out with Sibel and Manoli.